Chers téléspectateurs de WafricaTV, bienvenue à cette émission qui se préoccupe, comme d'habitude, des grandes questions de l'actualité intellectuelle. Ce matin, nous recevons deux philosophes de haut vol, tous deux venus de l'université de Bamenda, à savoir à ma gauche, le professeur MBIH Jérôme Tosam, et à ma droite, le professeur NGALIM BANFEGHA Valentin. Ils vont débattre sur une question aujourd'hui pertinente au vu de l'actualité mondiale par rapport aux variations des systèmes sanitaires à travers tous les pays. Nous vivons dans un contexte où prévaut ce qu'on appelle aujourd'hui une maladie devenue maladie mondiale, c'est le coronavirus. Et le titre de cette émission, Decolonising, African Philosophy of Medicine. D'entrée de jeu, je voudrais, chers téléspectateurs, commencer par le professeur MBIH Jérôme. Pourquoi avez-vous pensé, pourquoi pensez-vous qu'il faudrait décoloniser l'approche philosophique de la conception de la médecine? Et qui est le colonisateur dans cette affaire? Qui est le colonisé? Et pourquoi faut-il décoloniser?
Thank you very much, Professor Mouchili. And thanks to WafricaTV for this invitation. WafricaTV. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for this invitation. This topic is inspired by a recent observation. In recent years, there have been calls from both the global north and the global south for epistemic decolonization. And this invitation or this call for epistemic decolonization is provoked by the realization that the project of the Europeans in Africa was not only an economic and political project. It was, first of all, guided, informed by a gigantic project of mental, intellectual, and of course, scientific or epistemic colonization. Okay? We can discuss this topic from diverse perspective, from the perspective of education, from the perspective of the university, from the perspective of, even from the purely philosophical, religious perspective. And this project of European colonization, it was actually some kind of the universalization of a certain Eurocentrism or Eurocentric view. So it is from this background that I think that I came out with that topic, Decolonizing African Philosophy of Medicine. Now, maybe we begin by doing some kind of conceptual clarification or definition of terms. You know, when you talk about African philosophy of medicine and things like that, there's always that temptation that, okay, we have to start by proving whether or not there exists something like an African philosophy. I think that's, like you say in French, it's a question dépassé. Yeah, because here the concentration is more about actually doing the philosophy, African philosophy, and not trying to prove its existence. By doing it, it's already established, it's clear. Now, the philosophy of medicine is a new trend that emerged from the philosophy of science. Just like other disciplines like bioethics and things like that. It emerged about 30 to 40 years ago. And it came out of the realization that philosophy, there is a clear connection between philosophy and medicine. In fact, one of the contemporary proponents, one of the leading figures in philosophy of medicine and bioethics, of course, Edmond Pellegrino, says that medicine is the most humanistic of the sciences, and it is the most, and it is a science which has the most. It is the humanity, the humanity of the sciences that is most philosophical, if I could paraphrase Edmond Pellegrino.
Je voudrais juste vous lancer en vous demandant une chose. Existe-t-il actuellement dans la conception africaine de la médecine des concepts qui nous feraient prisonniers d'une conception autre ou d'une conception occidentale de la médecine?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question, and which falls exactly within the scope of what I'm talking about. The first thing you have to understand, to actually point out how the colonialists did not only focus on the political domination and economic exploitation of the colonized people. They first of all, they were able to define the boundary between what was valid knowledge and knowledge or invalid knowledge, if we could put it that way. And in the domain of medicine, which is the point of my concentration here, in the domain of medicine, in some countries, I'm thinking of the case of Tanzania, I'm thinking of the case of South Africa, which there are documents that actually show legislations that were passed on what was considered as valid form of medicine and what was considered as not valid form of medicine. For example, the colonialists banned all practices that were concerned with health issues that were connected with the paranormal. Okay? I'll come back to this question. So, they only validated forms of medicine that were concerned with some herbal forms of treatment. That, to me, to my judgment, it's because it fits somehow within the Western materialistic conception of the person.
Ok, là, je vous ai bien compris et je voudrais maintenant revenir au professeur Valentin Banfegha Galim. Bon, moi j'ai un problème. Est-il question de décoloniser ou alors est-ce qu'il est question de savoir si la médecine utilisée est efficace, rentable, s'il y a une production de résultats dans ce qu'on fait comme application médicale dans nos pays africains? Doit-on encore rester au niveau de la conceptualisation? Je vous écoute à ce sujet.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. I find this a very interesting question. I think both. We need to do both because we really need to decolonize. Because if you look at the questions surrounding the issue that Professor Mbi has just raised, you see that there's a point of certification. Who certifies whether this medicine is valid? And this begins from the point of view of the idea and not just the practice. The practice may be valid, justifiable, acceptable, but then it will be refused. And I would take it back to the West again. Look at the error that was raised within the European sciences in the 20th century, where reality was perceived to be, that is physical, unidimensional. But when you look at the spiritual dimension of reality, that's when you start understanding the place of African medicine. And this justifies the position that we are trying to hold here. If you take the African worldview, you understand the spiritual and the physical dimensions of the African worldview. And the practice of medicine is not a kind of an individualistic activity in Africa. And that changes the trend from that of the Western practice. You see, today we are talking about the problem of trust. We have a problem of trust with regard to even the COVID. There is one critique about the practice of African medicine that it is based on trial and error. When you look at the vaccines that are being given today, they give you the first, they ask for the second and the third. Are we not going back to trial and error? Does the critique against the practice of African medicine as trial and error still hold if we have to look at the present situation of the practice of Western medicine. So I think that the holistic perception of human nature and looking at it from the spiritual and the physical dimension is very important for understanding the practice of African medicine. So I think both we need to take the both dimensions, conceptual and as well as the practice itself.
Well, both of you are talking about practices. Bon, maintenant, puisque vous parlez tous des pratiques médicales, et chacun en s'appuyant sur le principe d'une volonté de décoloniser. Bon, monsieur, vous vous appelez Valentin.
Oui.
Lui s'appelle Jérôme.
Oui.
Ce sont des noms occidentaux.
Oui.
What do you want to decolonize? How can you decolonize being yourself, concerning your names?
Yeah.
Vos noms sont européens.
Yes.
Et vous voulez décoloniser. Et dans le processus de décolonisation, vous qui êtes tous deux déjà avec des noms à consonance chrétienne, est-ce que vous voulez décoloniser pour vous déconnecter aussi du système occidental? Ou alors ce n'est qu'en médecine qu'il faudra décoloniser? Et qu'est-ce qui fait qu'en décolonisant, notre système médical devient plus efficace? Moi, je voudrais vous relancer à ce sujet,
oui,
et que le professeur B prenne la parole après vous. Donc,
okay. Yes, thank you very much. I think we need to... yes, the name itself is a heritage. It's a colonial heritage, and it indicates a certain identity that is in me. I will not do away with the identity at the moment, but I must go back to my roots. I must go back to my roots, even if I have to maintain the name. And we relating this to the practice of medicine, of African medicine, as you are saying, it is not just the matter of the terminology of the concept, because my problem lies on the fact that who is the authority that certifies that this medicine is valid for us to use? That's my problem. That's where we have to decolonize. Whatever name that has to be given to it, who certifies that this is valid medicine to use to cure something? That is my problem with regard to. That's why I'm saying that we have to decolonize that philosophy of thinking that we have to receive all the directions from the West, even in the practice of medicine that they don't understand in particular.
Professeur B, Jérôme, moi je pense que dans les deux cas, la médecine s'applique sur des corps, des organismes dont les fonctions sont universellement établies. Il n'y a pas, ce n'est pas parce qu'on est africain ou non africain que notre système organique fonctionnerait différemment. Il existe des principes universels permettant de connaître le fonctionnement, l'organisation et la structure du corps. En quoi la décolonisation, comme vous l'avez dit tout à l'heure, pourrait permettre qu'on crée nécessairement une différence entre les deux types de médecine?
Okay, thank you so much. You asked very, very interesting questions, and I want to go. I want to go back to the two. They are very related questions you posed to him. But before I go there, I need to state that decolonizing consists of divesting ourselves, that is Africans, from Western categories of thought, Western superimposition and misrepresentation of African thought systems, which were aided by the religious authorities and things like that. And it is decolonization or conceptual or mental decolonization, and in the case of medicine, it's not about rejecting. It's not about rejecting everything Western. It is about engaging in a very, very rational and careful scrutiny of conceptions that have been imposed by Europeans on us. It calls on us not just to embrace everything that has been said about us and about our culture, about our systems of knowledge, our beliefs, our values, but it consists of critically setting them under a certain rational scrutiny a kind of Cartesian approach whereby you first of all subject all preconceived ideas to critical scrutiny, and they engage in selecting only those ones that can actually be proven or tested. That is it. So it's not about rejecting all, it's about taking a kind of a step behind, examining them. And when we do such an examination, we realize that the objective of Europeans in Africa was, first of all, to project the European, I talked about Eurocentrism, as a kind of superhuman, just near to God. And everything Western was considered as superior. You remember about the binary between the Europeans and indigenous people, for example. Now, for the African, they said he was a pagan. And for you to come out of paganism and darkness and barbarism, you had to be converted into Christianity. You had to be educated in Western system of education. A system of education in which you speak the Western language. I'll come back to this question. We are speaking a Western language here, whether French or English. You learn about European history. Okay, we did such in secondary school. You learn about European geography, literature. It's just recently that we began to introduce aspects of our own history, our own literature, our own philosophy. For example, you belong to a department of philosophy in the University of Yaoundé 1. Now, if you look at the program from first year to the PhD, you will just barely count a few courses in African philosophy. That's already a problem of imbalance, where we spend all of our time studying others and not studying ourselves. Now, let me come back to the crux of the matter here about medicine, which is our focus in this discussion. You would see that the predominant Western conception of the human person, and of course the patient, is largely a materialistic, mechanistic conception, which has its origin from Descartes and Newton. But within the African understanding of a person is viewed from a very holistic dimension. And therefore, disease is not only defined as some material entity which causes a dysfunction in the body, but we could talk, disease can be caused by social phenomena.
Oui, si je vous ai bien compris,
Yeah.
est-ce que à ce niveau, il faut parler de décolonisation ou il faut parler d'élargissement du champ des diagnostics? C'est-à-dire, j'ai entendu dans vos propos le concept de diversifier. Est-ce que diversification peut renvoyer à décolonisation? Et si il est question de soigner efficacement et que la pratique ne tient pas compte de nos valeurs culturelles, ça veut dire que la faute peut être vue au niveau du diagnostic qui est posé. Est-ce qu'il ne faut pas tout simplement parler de diagnostic au lieu de parler de décolonisation?
Okay. Yes, I think looking at the process of decolonization, I understand the point you are bringing with regard to diversity. The problem is in the concept of decolonization, we are thinking about critical selection of what is relevant to our own needs. Yeah, we talk of the goat does not eat all the grass it sees. Rightly, as Prof. Jérôme said, that we are not rejecting in the concept of decolonization, but we are critically selecting what is relevant and also affirming, because in the process of self-affirmation of our own identity, we need to decolonize. Because if we just diversify, I think there is a possibility of us being drowned within the sea of Western categories in that practice.
Je pose le problème de l'élargissement du champ de diagnostic parce que nous souffrons tous des mêmes maladies.
Oui.
Oui. Et si on intègre le monisme, parce que je ne sais pas, quand vous dites qu'il y a une autre façon de considérer l'être humain en Afrique, est-ce que vous pensez que dans le contexte occidental, on ne sait pas que l'homme est lié à l'environnement, on ne sait pas que l'homme a des pratiques culturelles et culturelles qui pourraient influencer le type de diagnostic à poser en cas de maladie? Parce qu'on peut manifester tous les mêmes symptômes,
Oui.
mais ne pas bénéficier nécessairement des mêmes traitements. Est-ce que c'est à ce niveau aujourd'hui qu'il faut poser le problème, professeur Jérôme?
Thank you. My direct response to your question, whether we should be talking about decolonization or diversification, my answer is will be both. I want to quote a Portuguese theoretician of decolonization. I'm talking about Boaventura de Sousa Santos. He's a professor of sociology, and he has written enormously on this question of epistemic decolonization. And this is what he says in one of his books, in one of his writings on the epistemic decolonization or epistemic injustice, something of that nature, where he talks about epistemicide, which has occurred. He's talking about it from a global perspective, because within even Europe, there is a kind of a divide between the Northern Europe and Southern Europe. Portugal is in Southern Europe. And this is what he says: alternatives are not lacking. What is lacking is an alternative thinking of alternatives. So what we are saying, I've just indicated already that decolonizing does not consist of a complete rejection of the other. It consists of coming back, a kind of, we'll go back to that Socratic invitation. Man, know thyself. The project of colonization focused very much on de-Africanizing the African in such a way that the African was meant to even look at his or her values as inferior, the inferiorization. Colonialism, Eurocentrism was characterized by epistemic superiorization. I'm not done
C'est juste
yet.
pour vous relancer.
Okay.
Je suis encore avec vous. Il dit ceci: est-ce que le principe de logique, de nécessité et d'objectivité ou d'universalité qui encadre la pratique médicale moderne, que vous appelez occidentale, je n'arrive pas, je ne suis pas totalement d'accord avec vous. Bon, est-ce que ce principe qui caractérise les pratiques médicales ne sont pas de nature à enlever de votre mémoire la volonté de continuer à croire qu'il s'agit d'une médecine exclusivement occidentale, imposée à tous, alors que cela pourrait ne pas être le cas? Moi, je le dis pourquoi. Il y a une idée qui me vient dans la tête. Bon, la différence au niveau des pratiques. Comment on pratique la médecine africaine et quelle différence trouvez-vous entre cette pratique et la pratique médicale moderne? C'est ça mon problème. Si vous arrivez à déterminer la différence, là, on peut comprendre la nécessité de décoloniser.
Okay. What I'll say here is that we live in a situation, in a time where for more than 500 years, the Western world has adopted a certain position, I'll call it even an illegitimate position, of speaking for others. When somebody speaks for you, the person defines being for you. When somebody speaks for you, the person tells a story about you from his perspective. We have different conceptual understandings of reality. And what we need is not a universalization of a certain ethnocentric view which has become the most dominant view, because politically, economically, and militarily they have power to defend and spread this view. We are the decolonial approach favors a pluriversal approach. This is a word which is used by Santos. Okay, a pluriversal approach gives room for other perspectives to be listened to. It gives voice to other perspectives, and not a kind of a view where to paraphrase the expression in the Bible, where the Western view of the world and Western medicine, Western modern medicine, is viewed as the truth, or is it the way, the truth, and the light? Okay, so for any other medical tradition to accede to that level of scientificity, it has to be validated. But knowledge is a labyrinth. We can only be able to understand a certain dimension of it. We cannot have a complete grasp of it. So the importance of allowing other traditions of medicine to be studied, to be expressed, or to pay attention to other. You cannot deny something as invalid when you don't even understand it.
Professeur Ngalim, je voudrais revenir à vous. Et ma question est celle-ci. Est-ce que vous pensez réellement que la médecine en Afrique, ou bien la pratique africaine de la médecine est aussi négligée? Dans un pays comme le Sénégal, les deux médecines se côtoient. Il y a ce qu'ils appellent la médecine moderne et la médecine alternative. Ça, c'est la première question. La deuxième question, c'est est-ce que vous continuez à penser que la médecine moderne est occidentale, même si le principe est fondé scientifiquement? Est-ce que si les Occidentaux ont été les premiers à penser une médecine scientifiquement fondée, est-ce que c'est parce que ça a commencé là-bas qu'on doit appeler ça médecine occidentale? Est-ce que ce n'est pas tout simplement la médecine moderne? Puisque les principes, il n'y a rien qui colle à l'occidental de façon biologique.
Oui.
Nous pouvons développer la médecine, la même médecine à partir d'ici. Bon, maintenant, moi, je continue à penser que, en fonction des milieux, la nature des diagnostics devrait respecter les entités mentales, c'est-à-dire la culture, de chaque individu. Mais est-ce que cela revient à dire qu'il faudrait sortir, même pas, il ne s'agit pas de sortir, vous avez dit qu'il ne s'agit pas de sortir dans la décolonisation, mais qu'il faut tout simplement élargir la perspective diagnostique? Professor Ngalim.
Yes, I accept what you are saying, but from your explanation, I see that there is a need for complementarity. I understand what you are saying very well, but in the context of this complementarity, we also have to underline what is the perception of science that each culture is having? What is the perception of man that each culture is having? Professor B raised the issue of the mechanistic conception of human nature, because that perception has an influence on the way you yourself practice the medicine. And if African medicine the practice of African could be considered modern as well. Modern, as you are saying, it's not like it is Western medicine. But if we look at it from the perspective of complementarity, you will understand that the African traditional medicine is neglected. And I will just give you an example of how many medical doctors trained in our own context have the basic knowledge of African traditional medicine. Just that, again, tells you that it's neglected.
Compared to Chinese, who study medicine, modern medicine in China, there is
a complementarity.
You meet a Chinese medical doctor, he has some level of knowledge in traditional Chinese medicine.
Oui, là je vous comprends. Mais ce que je demande, est-ce que c'est africaine, on connaît dans l'usage, d'un paradigme de traitement, est-ce qu'on sait dans le paradigme quel est le principe actif? C'est-à-dire, l'herbe que j'utilise pour soigner une blessure, est-ce que la pratique traditionnelle africaine permettrait de parvenir à un niveau tel que je comprenne exactement le principe actif d'une plante?
I think there is a dimension in the practice of African medicine that we have to also understand, spiritual dimension. And the spiritual dimension also carries the hidden,
Do you think that there is no spiritual dimension in Europe?
Yeah, there is, but the conception has been materialized. It has been materialized. And that's why I talked about the conception of man. Because in Africa, it is not an individual that cures. It's not an individual. The whole community. A medicine man may be an individual, but he is curing alongside with his ancestors. So it is like the physical and the spiritual worldviews are active in the process.
Sometimes.
Yes, and at times you may not even have you may not have full knowledge. She said you cannot have full knowledge of what is really going on, but this relies on prayer. So there's a complementarity between prayer and the applications of the necessary medical plans that are there.
Si vous croyez que la conception occidentale est davantage mécaniciste, mais que pensez-vous de la psychiatrie, de la psychologie, de la psychanalyse? Est-ce que vous ne pensez pas qu'ils ont pris en charge la dimension de la psyché, c'est-à-dire ce qui commande nos mécanismes mentaux? Est-ce qu'ils n'ont pas pris en charge dans la psychanalyse, dans la psychiatrie, dans la psychologie? Professor Jérôme.
Maybe before I respond to that question, let me just say that what we are discussing about is quite a question of a very fundamental nature. I talked about our systems of education that have predominantly been the case since independence. And there is a political dimension to this, where we're meant to think that our values were quite inferior. And this approach of the Western worldview was pushed to a certain limit. Now, coming back to your question, gradually, Western medicine is beginning to allow this psychological perspective. Psychiatry is coming into play. Now, but there is this spiritual and paranormal dimension, which you agree with me that within our context, where traditional medicine can also be considered to be conventional, because as the World Health Organization tells us, about 85% of Africans rely on traditional medicine for their health concerns. Now, our first point of call when we fall sick, what is it? When we go to the hospital, we don't get a clear diagnosis of what we're suffering from, but we're suffering. We move back to check from traditional medicine, and we consult those who are specialized in such kind of diagnosis. You could actually find out that such a problem is not something that can be physically attended to or solved. It's something that will require that you talk with your ancestors. You talk with your family. It could be an issue where the family could come together and they agree on something. It's a social dimension. Okay? And there are so many perspectives. We could talk about the individualistic perspective of healthcare. Okay? Which is not, when you fall sick here, there's a whole family that is involved. Isn't it? But within the Western perspective, somebody could say, okay, if I have this kind of a problem, please don't try to help me recover. I'm ready to die. But such a decision is not something, an individual is not seen as an abstract entity here, but the humanness of a person is seen as a shared value, whereby decisions even about ourselves are not taken individually. It's a matter of consensus, okay, where we reconcile all conflicting ideas, and then we take decisions even about health, even about end-of-life decisions and things like that. I think these are perspectives that need to be taken when it comes to medicine, when it comes to medical decisions, health decisions, and so on and so forth. I think the time does not really permit us to really get deep into some of these very important aspects.
Je suis un peu perplexe quand vous parlez de la dimension paranormale qui pourrait caractériser une maladie et faire en sorte que, à partir de l'approche médicale moderne, qu'on ne puisse pas soigner le malade. Moi, je voudrais aussi qu'on sache que dans le système médical moderne, on sait que nos cellules sont vivantes. Et pendant que nous sommes malades, les cellules se battent pour que la maladie guérisse. Bon, maintenant, quand vous parlez de... parce que j'ai lu un livre, celui de Birago Diop. Et dans ce livre, il dit que les Africains étaient des savants illettrés. Parce que les Africains ont toujours eu une approche presque scientifique de la connaissance du monde et même des divinités. Parce qu'ils ont été très liés à la nature. Et ils savaient que dans la nature, la nature regorge de beaucoup d'énergie. Et toute cette énergie leur permettait de croire que c'est en la nature qu'il faut trouver son Dieu. La dimension chrétienne européenne est venue avec cette volonté de situer la transcendance en dehors de ce monde. Et on a pensé à ce niveau-là que la matière serait inerte et c'est une dimension spirituelle qui mettrait les hommes en mouvement. Or, les Africains ont toujours su que l'homme est une capacité énergétique qui communique directement avec la nature. Est-ce que vous ne... Bon, je ne pense pas qu'il faudrait situer cela dans le champ de la paranormalité. Mais pour vous, professeur Ngalim, est-ce que vous ne pensez pas qu'il faudrait nécessairement se demander, à partir du moment où il y a la psychanalyse, la psychologie, la psychiatrie dans la médecine moderne, se demander s'il ne faudrait pas former nos pratiquants traditionnels à un niveau d'élévation mentale afin qu'on puisse codifier l'approche, ce qui serait bénéfique pour tout le monde, au lieu de rester dans un système charlataniste ou fétichiste qui ne permettrait qu'à certaines personnes qu'on appelle initiées d'être les seuls soignants au point où quand ils mourront, ça sera terminé. Je voudrais...
Okay, yeah. That is very interesting. Yeah, I get the point you are making, but you also have to understand that within that context, we have to give the African traditional medicine practitioners the confidence that they have. Yeah, it is important to really improve and get it, to improve and get it, let's say, codified, as you are saying, to the standard that is acceptable. But you have to understand that there are certain realities that will not definitely be as such. I think if you look at the practice of divination, for example, the different dimensions of divination, how are we going to codify that in the practice of medicine in particular? What I think is that there can only be a complementarity between the practice of modern medicine and the practice of African traditional medicine, because we may not necessarily have to raise African medicine to the level of standard that it should be codified. If we are raising it, we just have to complement, because there are some practices there that may not necessarily be open to consumption as such.
But on devrait ouvrir cette pratique médicale africaine parce que en 2050, il y aura une augmentation de 2 degrés de température. Il y a beaucoup de catégories de végétation qui vont disparaître. Professeur Jérôme, la médecine africaine en ce moment-là se comportera comment si on reste dans une tradition qui n'évolue pas?
I agree with you about trying to bring traditional medicine to a certain level. But don't forget about the political dimensions of medicine and of science also. You talk about the methods, the principles, and things like that. Who lays down these principles? And I think that still in line with the idea of decolonizing, we need to even decolonize these methods and these principles. You would say that these methods have permitted us to actually get hold of, to get some of the best. I will not say best because we are advancing. We don't know what we know as a medical solution for some health problems today. We could get better solutions. But what I'm trying to say is that there are solutions within indigenous or traditional African medicine which have been ignored, silenced, and even derided or mocked at, which needs to be paid attention to. Now, when you look at most of our research is still in the line of colonization. Our researchers, mostly in Africa, carry out research that is likely not relevant. And why? Because our politicians, our governments do not sponsor research. We need to sponsor research in this area if we actually want this to be systematized, codified, as you talk about. The fact that we don't understand, or we say that it's within the spiritual domain. So many of the things that we have we call science today, in the past were considered as purely things we could not explain. But gradually, after concentration,
si la est ainsi, ça veut dire que la médecine africaine est achevée. Étant donné que nous sommes tous dans ce monde global, où de nouvelles maladies naissent des addictions. Une addiction, vous êtes trop rattaché à votre téléphone, vous êtes trop rattaché au poste téléviseur, vous êtes trop rattaché à tel ou tel autre type de gadget. Bon, comme la médecine africaine ne s'ouvre pas à cela, puisque vous êtes dans une logique de tradition, est-ce qu'on pourra encore consulter les traditionalistes pour guérir les maladies qui naissent des addictions?
No, I'm not talking about, it's true. It's not traditional medicine that is not open. It is our institutions that is not open up to indigenous forms of medicine. And it is still remnant of that colonization, that epistemic colonization, which is aimed at indicating that no, there's nothing good there. So we need to pay attention to it also, just as much as we pay attention to Western forms of medicine. Now, you're talking about solutions to new modern kind of addictions that have come as a result of new technologies and things like that. We don't, even in our generations, we did not know all of these things. We used to have different ways of using our competencies and things like that. Like I was watching the social media today, I saw one young man, about 12, 13 years, who has created it's a small box where he has different people on that box. One person was pounding, one person was clearing, and I did not understand how that young man did it. But this is a young man who spends his time, instead of browsing on the telephone, he's trying to be creative. He's thinking. And then you see a young man who use cartoons to produce maybe a not a skyscraper, a bulldozer, and a young man who has never learned mechanics, auto mechanics, just observes, takes several years, constructs a car.
Bon, en dehors des témoignages qu'on a souvent des résultats de la médecine traditionnelle africaine, existe-t-il d'autres principes permettant de vérifier de façon standard l'efficacité de cette médecine traditionnelle? Bon, autre question. Traditional medicine is to come or is already there?
No, it's already there. It's already there.
It has always been there.
It just needs to be discovered. That's why he said there is negligence in the research. It is like the hidden truth that needs to be discovered and unveiled for people to exploit for human flourishing, for human health and development. And from the perspective of, there's another perspective where he talked about the paranormal dimension of African traditional medicine. I think that is an aspect that is very, very important, but not so much exhibited.
What do you mean by paranormal?
The supernatural realities, the supernatural dimension which African traditional medicine exploits to handle cases that will not directly be handled by the physical plants. For example, if I tell you that there are African traditional medicines who will carry out bone therapies barehanded, without use of anything, even from a distance, and cure the patient, those are realities that you need to enter to see the mechanism. Using, they call it sympathetic magic, and healing an individual.
L'Occidental pourrait aussi vous dire qu'à l'hôpital Jameau, on soigne certaines psychoses juste à partir des causeries avec les psychiatres. Là, on n'a pas besoin de médicaments. On peut utiliser le médicament juste pour vous aider à vous calmer, non pas pour soigner le mal de la conscience que vous avez. Vous constatez bien qu'on n'a même plus les fous de nos pays, chez les tradipraticiens, quand on les amène à Jamon et guérissent. Et est-ce que vous ne pensez pas à ce niveau que la médecine occidentale tient aussi compte de cette dimension spirituelle dont vous parlez?
I think we already handled the question.
Oui, vous avez parlé de cela. Mais vous revenez, pour vous, quand vous entrez dans la spiritualité africaine, c'est pour évoquer le paranormal. Et je ne comprends pas ce que vous entendez par paranormal ici. Parce que déjà, la folie n'est pas normale. Hein? Si la folie n'est pas normale et qu'on soigne ça normalement, pourquoi entrer dans le paranormal alors que le normal peut déjà donner des résultats?
Ça dépend des causes.
Well, we can actually get to the norm. It's not all the time that the normal provides solution to problems that are obviously physically perceived. Yes. The issue we're talking about here is for us to give a voice to this system of medicine, this tradition of medicine, which has not been taken seriously. Where most of our, I was talking about most of our researchers, what they do within our context is that they are more of data collectors for Western funding institutions.
The problem is to take it seriously.
This is the thing, and this is why I'm talking about decolonizing, because that colonial mentality is not over. Okay, it's not over. If you meet, there are very few African trained, even Western trained medical practitioners. When you start telling them about some dimensions of indigenous African medicine, they dismiss it even without verification. Like he gave an example of bone setting.
Le temps nous prend la gorge. Bon, il m'a pas dit comment ce qu'il pense de la paranormalité, et je voudrais qu'en concluant que vous puissiez nous dire en quoi la prise en charge médicale en Afrique est plus holistique qu'en Occident. Ça, c'est la question à laquelle vous répondrez juste après lui. Mais je voudrais qu'il nous dise comment, est-ce que c'est une forme de psychiatrie africaine que de prendre en charge une maladie paranormale? Bon, le problème c'est que jusqu'ici on ne comprend pas. La paranormalité m'échappe.
No, I understand what you are saying, but we cannot reduce the process in Africa to that psychiatric process is more of counseling and applications of certain techniques to cure a physical problem when the cause is physical.
A mental problem.
A mental problem, but mental, depending the cause. Because if the cause has a spiritual dimension, like having problems with your ancestors that are unresolved, you won't solve them with psychiatric techniques and analysis. You will have to go back to that spirit, that paranormal, that supernatural dimension to be able to have a solution. If the cause is supernatural, the cure cannot be physical. So that is where the African traditional medicine takes a greater perspective than the modern medicine.
Why I think indigenous African tradition of medicine is more holistic in the sense that it considers the person, the human person, not only from his or her materiality. I can easily get an objection that now Western modern medicine is already incorporating this dimension. Yeah, but traditional African medicine englobes aspects of the physical, englobes aspects of the environmental, natural, englobes aspects of the communal. Professor Godfrey Tangwa talks about eco-bao communitarianism. Okay, it is ecological. It involves nature generally, and then it involves the community, not only that of the living community, but even including the supernatural dimensions of reality. And in the practice of medicine, these holistic dimension are brought into play in the diagnosis, in the treatment, and in the understanding of health and healthcare.
Merci, chers téléspectateurs de WafricaTV, d'avoir suivi cette émission à forte senteur philosophique. Nous remercions les professeurs Banfegha Ngalim Valentin de Bamenda et le professeur MBIH Jérôme Tosam de la même université de Bamenda. Le présentateur, c'était moi, le professeur Mouchili de l'université de Yaoundé 1 à la faculté des arts, lettres et sciences humaines. Et je pense que cette question est riche. Il s'agit d'une émission dense et on pourrait y revenir. Pour remercier de votre attention.
Thank you for the great opportunity.